Welcome to the mid-career or early career researcher workshop session. We've got some wonderful panelists joining us today to talk about how to become an effective mentor. But before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on Ngunnawal country, which is in Canberra, capital of Australia, acknowledging the cultural contributions that the Ngunnawal people make to the university, but to the Canberra region as well. And so today's session, we have three wonderful panelists, as I said, talking about how to become an effective mentor. You'll find some really fantastic information in that session, and you have an opportunity to ask questions of the panel once all three people have presented. So what I would suggest is, if you suddenly think of something you'd like to ask, please go ahead and pop it in the chat box. I'll keep an eye on that throughout the session. And then once we've finished with our presentations, I'll either read out those questions if they're still sitting there, or you'll have an opportunity to perhaps pop your hand up and ask the questions. So I think that that's probably going to be the most effective way of making sure that we have everything done. If you have any tech issues, we do have someone keeping an eye on that for us as well. So please put something in the chat if you need to, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask from a technology perspective. But otherwise, I think we're pretty good to go. So Candice, you're first on the list. Candice is going to share some slides and then we'll get the session underway. Thank you.
Good. I'm assuming everyone can see that first slide.
Not yet. It hasn't come up yet.
Okay, let me get out of this then.
Whilst we're waiting for the slide to pop up, it would be wonderful if you could, in the chat box, pop a little hello, let us know who you are, and also you can acknowledge whose country you're sitting on, please.
Just trying that again.
Wonderful, thanks. I can see the start of the thing. Yep.
Okay, good to go now.
That's great. Thanks so much.
Just to our participants, I'd just like to acknowledge that yesterday in New Zealand was Waitangi Day, and today is the public holiday, the public observance of Waitangi Day. So I'm just going to start with a very brief mihi mihi to introduce myself. Tēnā koutou. I whānau mai arho ai, Palmerston North. Ko kapiti te moana, e noho ana arho ai Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, no Shetland Islands, ako tipuna, ko Candice Harris, aho ngā mihi. So basically I've told you that I grew up in Palmerston North in New Zealand. I identify quite strongly with the region of Kapiti and the island and the ocean there. My grandparents were born in the Shetland Islands, and my name is Candice Harris. So thank you. Right, hopefully this will be an exciting session that we're presenting with my partners in crime, Karen and also Sam. I'm just going to begin by, I've got about 3 slides to actually get through to challenge some of the things and perhaps some of your ideas about what mentoring is and perhaps what mentoring isn't. But the first thing I'd like you to perhaps reflect on is, what do we consider to be mid-career? So how do you frame perhaps mid-career in terms of tenure? That's perhaps length that you've spent already at your institution or within your academic career, your position, or perhaps you think about mid-career in terms of age, or even your financial status, or perhaps even your emotional status. And what I mean by that is your reflections on, how do I feel doing this career, and how long do I envisage that I'd like to be continuing? Perhaps the skills that you have gained, you sort of think, yeah, in terms of my skill set, I do recognize that perhaps I'm mid-career. And overall, your academic identity. So I'm now going to talk about perhaps what mentoring is or isn't. And I'm hoping some of these may make you smile, but each of these I have on this slide for quite a specific reason. So mentoring is not marriage. And what I mean by that is, you know, it's not this lifelong commitment that you are entering into nor is it therapy. It's not someone that you ring every time you're having a bad day to reach out to your mentor and to moan about perhaps everyone that you work with. It shouldn't be painful either. It should actually be quite productive and quite inspiring to some degree. Nor should it be last minute. You know, perhaps you have a grant application, so you seek out the person down the hall and you call them your mentor and quick, can you read this? Or a PhD examination report, you know, perhaps it's your first. It shouldn't be casual either. You like Barry who's moved into the office next door, and after 6 months you're calling Barry your mentor. That's not how it works. Mentoring is not also line management. You should not be mentoring those that you formally manage. And I want to make that point quite clearly. Mentoring is not also a role conceived for promotion purposes. Nothing gets us a bit more uptight on a promotion committee if we read your application and we see that suddenly you're claiming to mentor 5 people and you have no explanation of really for what purposes, when the mentoring relationship started, what the outcomes are, etc. It's like you've just gathered some mentees for the purposes of promotion. Mentoring is not also simply postgraduate supervision. So you may have, as part of your workload, maybe 3 supervisions. You don't get to call them all your mentees all of a sudden. Mentoring should not also be a surprise to the mentee. And perhaps if you are suddenly calling yourself a mentor for the purposes of promotion, that may be a surprise to some. I remember sitting on a promotion committee once, and I saw that 3 different people had claimed this one person all as a mentee. And I thought, gosh, you know, does the mentee actually know? Mentoring also should not be things like cloning. What I mean is trying to produce people exactly like you. It shouldn't be worship where your mentee is expected to say incredibly positive things about you all the time. It's not about producing academic rock stars, if you know what I mean. These sort of, you know, really famous people. If only I could be mentored by that person in my field or that journal editor, etc. And it's not about creating sub-tribes either. So perhaps people have, you know, a clear identity within their department, but if they could just be included in that little mentoring group, that would be great as well. So what is mentoring then? Well, formal mentoring, and you've got to remember I'm Professor of Management here, so I sort of talk from that organisational development point of view. So if it's done properly, it is organised with clear expectations and boundaries. Okay, it's not meeting for a chat and a bit of a moan. Also, the purpose of mentoring needs to be something very specific and linked to a strategic objective, hopefully of your faculty, more so of your organisation, your overall university. So it needs to be for something specific. Some examples I can think of just off the top of my head could be translating research for public audiences. Maybe you, so far in your career, have been great at writing for academic audiences, but suddenly your university is incredibly interested in research impact, and suddenly you've been expected to do things like media, etc., which the idea you may find terrifying. So perhaps mentoring could be, you know, a really specific purpose around that. It could be for managing academics. Maybe you've had a great career up until now, and suddenly you're in a management position and you don't really know how to perhaps go about this. Perhaps it could be mentoring around establishing your confidence and your voice. So how do you kind of divorce yourselves, I guess, from former PhD supervisors who perhaps have also been managers, and identify your own kind of trajectory and career. Perhaps it could be about something as important as work-life balance also. So mentoring needs to be professional, and it needs to be safe, it's regular, it's structured, and it operates over a set time period. A lot of formal mentoring programs actually advise that you're in a mentoring relationship for no more than perhaps 6 months to a year. Okay, this doesn't go on for years and years and years and years. Ideally too, you want to find a mentor who is a good performer, who is experienced, and who is reflexive, that they will sort of reflect on their own practice and perhaps hone their own skills in this area as well. If you find that you have a mentoring first meeting, and Karen's going to talk about this more, and the mentor does nothing but moan about the university, I would suggest that you ring your organisational development department and ask for a new mentor, okay? Generally, we actually need people who, as I said, are good performance experienced, but also are interested in achieving the strategic objectives that everyone's meeting for. Mentoring also needs to be measurable. What are the outcomes? And supported by the organisation, so that the OD people are actually involved in this as well. So before you sign up to mentoring as either a mentor or a mentee, have a look at, how perhaps what's the role of organizational development here? How do they promote mentoring? How do they resource it, etc.? How are they training people? How are they signing up people? How are they finding those mentors and mentee relationships? There has been a lot of study done about mentoring as well. And so there are various models that you might like to look at. A lot of good universities also have documentation you'll find in your organizational development department about, a handbook for mentoring, etc. But just remember, I'll just say in closing, mentors need development and mentees need to understand that they're emerging on a formal organizational development practice. So I'm doing some performance planning with staff at the moment. We often do these to set up the year, and some people are just throwing on documents, I want a mentor. And so the first question I'm saying, for what purpose? Okay, so it's just not a tick box exercise as well. So thank you. I will pass on now to Karen.
Thank you, Candice. And whilst we wait for you to stop sharing your slides and for Karen's to pop up, just a reminder to everyone to pop any questions you might have as you think of them in the chat box, and we'll get to those at the end of the sessions. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you, Naomi. And I'd also like to start with a short mihi. Tēnā koutou katoa, mihi ana ki ngā mana whenua ko Karen Smith toko ingoa no te whanganui tawa aho, mahi ana hi o rangi ki te haranga waka, tēnā koutou katoa. I've just welcomed you. I've also acknowledged Maori iwi and their rights over this land. I'm from Wellington, I now live in Wellington. I'm Professor of Tourism Management at Te Haranga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington, and I'm also an Associate Dean of Teaching and Learning in the Wellington School of Business and Government. I've been both a mentee and a mentor at different points of my career, and I didn't start by being a mentee and then have just done mentoring. I've actually been a mentee quite recently, as well, as I identified particular purposes in my career that I wanted to support in. For my section of this workshop, I'm going to talk about how to set up, maintain and conclude effective mentoring relationships. And I'm actually going to focus on the perspective of the mentor. Some of you will be interested in this session because you're looking to be a mentee, or maybe you're currently a mentee, but many of you are in the part of your career where you might start to be asked or would like to take more of a mentoring role. So that'll be kind of the focus of where I'm looking. I am going to draw on a couple of resources for this, and Candice has already mentioned that if you're in a more formal program, for example, within your institution, you may well have some documentation and support, and there's lots of sources out there as well. Some of you might be part of the Corthy mentoring program that we launched this year. So we have paired up PhD and early career researchers with some of our more experienced fellows and academics. And I'm going to draw on some of the guidelines that we prepared there. They were actually prepared by my colleague here at Victoria University of Wellington, Ina Reichenberger, so thank you to her. And they're actually based on some of the guidelines that have been prepared for our internal university mentoring program. So I'd like to acknowledge my own institution there as well. There are lots of other sources. A source I really like is this source from the New Zealand Royal Society, looking at mentoring out in New Zealand research community. Even if you're not based in New Zealand, I think it's a really valuable resource, particularly because it focuses on a cultural context. So it draws on Pakeha or Western concepts of mentoring, but also thinks about Indigenous, so in our case Maori, but also Pacifica perspectives. And I think it's really relevant to mentoring relationships which are in cross-cultural relationships as well. So even if you're mentoring someone within your own institution, you may well find there is a very strong cross-cultural element as well. So I think they've got a really good short resource that you might want to look at as well. Now, as Candice has also talked about, there are various forms of mentoring programs. So some of them may be formalized within your institution. They may be through an external organization, such as the Corthy program. They may be part of a research program. So some large research schemes will actually have mentoring as part of their support for upcoming researchers. And sometimes they can also be more informal, but I think once they're more informal, let's refer back to some of the things that Candice talked about mentoring not being. So I'm going to particularly focus probably on the more formalized mentoring relationships. Now, in some cases, if you're starting on the journey as a mentor, somebody might have actually approached you and asked you to be involved. In others, you will have identified that you'd like to get involved as a mentor. Perhaps you've put in an expression of interest if there's been a call for mentors. Perhaps you've been shoulder tapped by somebody about being a mentor. I think it's really important to consider your own motivations. Candice talked about some of those things in terms of promotion committee, and certainly the wanting something to put on your promotion application shouldn't be the driving force behind you stepping forward. But nevertheless, it is important to recognize there are different things that you will be looking to get out of the mentoring. Nevertheless, it's really important to recognize that really mentoring is primarily based on the needs of the mentee. You need to be aware of your motivations, and hopefully some of those motivations will be rewarded and met. But it's really the focus here is on the mentee and their needs. So let me just take you through, and this is actually my last slide, but the one with most on. Let me take you through the sort of a 4-stage timeline to just talk about some of those things about setting up, maintaining, and also concluding or ending an effective mentoring relationship. Now, obviously, some of you will have been in a mentee relationship already, and you might look at it from that perspective. But in terms of being a mentor and coming into this, you also need to think about the expectations that you have of the relationship and the different roles that you both take. Whilst the mentees should really drive the mentoring process, I've often found that as a mentor, you often need to sort of take a little bit more of initiative at the beginning, particularly if you're more senior than your mentee, who in some cases might feel a little bit in awe that you've actually agreed to be their mentee or their mentor, and you might need to take a little bit more kind of drive to start with. But very quickly, I think it's making sure that the mentee is owning this relationship. It's them who are sort of reaching out with a purpose for this, so really driving this. I try to do a little bit of preparation before that first meeting with my mentees. Sometimes, and particularly if you're in a formal program, mentoring program, you'll have got some information about your mentor. So you might be given a copy of an expression of interest that they've put in to join the mentoring program, where they've already started to think about and put down some of the things they'd like to get out of working in a relationship with you. That's really helpful to start to think about how you might frame this. Sometimes you might just have been given them a copy of their CV, or you've looked them up on the university website. It's not doing an in-depth trawl of everything they've ever put on the social media, but it starts to kind of build a relationship so you can understand a little bit more perhaps about where they are and where they're coming from. It's important to think about not only about the timing of your mentoring meetings, but also thinking about the place. Now, it's very easy to default to online, but we still have a lot of mentoring relationships which actually might be in person, particularly if they're within your own institution. So thinking about in a neutral space, often meeting in one or other offices can be useful in that if you can close the door and you've got nobody, you can have that closed space that you won't be interrupted. But often we might be sharing offices, or actually the mentee might not actually want to kind of be quite as sort of obvious that they're in a mentoring relationship. So I think it's important to think about a neutral space. Sometimes that might be a public space, like a sort of cafe. I've always recommended, particularly if you're on a campus university, probably not the cafe in the middle of the campus. Go off-site, perhaps, make this a deliberate point that you actually meet somewhere away from your sort of work situation. It's also important to think about things like time and length of the meeting. Most of the sort of mentoring relationships I've been in, you block out an hour of the time, but I've always in my own calendar put out a little bit more just for those times when something that can't just close off at the sort of 55-minute sort of mark, but generally thinking about that. If you're thinking and looking at mentoring in an online context, I do think thinking about space and place is important as well. Is somebody going to be sitting in the corner of their lounge and end up talking about things that they might not actually want their family to hear? Are they actually sitting again in a shared space? And again, that might influence. So thinking around space as well. So that all important first meeting often is very focused on thinking about a mentoring agreement. It's, in some cases, I've seen people sort of put this in a very formalized way. I tend to do it that after that meeting, the mentee will just type it up in an email so that we've both got it rather than a sort of formal agreement. But thinking about things like expectations, the different boundaries that you have, talking explicitly about things like confidentiality and possible conflicts of interest and how you might deal with them. It's particularly important, I think, if you're mentoring somebody who's perhaps in a close relationship in your own institution. So they might be part of your own department, or you have a potential to actually overlap with some of their everyday work. So talk about that before you get into a position where you need to respond. Talk about the practicalities of the meeting, and also a timeline. And as Candice said, it's often about thinking about how long do you want the mentoring relationship to take, and have some checking points where you actually reflect on how it's going. Third element I just wanted to briefly talk about was structuring the sessions. Now, this can happen in different ways. Some people just have a very unstructured approach. A lot of the mentoring guides suggest some level of structure can help and make both the time and the relationship count. So there'll obviously be some checking in, how you've been since the last meeting, but having a focus issue for a particular meeting is often a good idea. So that you've got something, you might identify that in advance of the meeting, that you're actually going to focus on to explore during that particular session. And that's when we bring in our communication skills. And if you want to access the Corthy resource, it talks about things like listening, things like clarifying and thinking questions, taking the role, and I'm thinking here as a mentor, thinking about how you reframe things that your mentee talks about, both in terms of content and context, but also that you'll have a role to play sometimes in terms of acknowledging and validating what they've heard. Sometimes you will, it's not all about you as a mentor, but sometimes you will perhaps show some of your own vulnerability and authenticity by sharing your own experiences to create mutual understanding. But as Candice says, it's not about creating a mini me. Your experiences are not necessarily going to be the same as your mentee, but actually sharing some of those might actually enable the mentee to share their own. You'll often want to, at the close of a session, try and seek some kind of resolutions around what's going to happen next. Perhaps the mentee, or perhaps sometimes even the mentor, will have some actions that they're going to do. They might check back against some of the stated goals and summarize what's come out of that particular meeting. And then review about kind of perhaps anything that could be changed or improved for meeting next time. And then I briefly wanted to talk about sort of review and conclusion and ending the relationship, because I think that's just as important as starting the mentoring relationship. In some cases, you'll be part of a time-limited program. So in my own institution, we have sort of an annual call for mentoring. The program, by the time it gets set up, typically is sort of around about a 9 to 12 month relationship. But sometimes you'll actually end that relationship early for a range of different reasons. Maybe the goals that the mentee set at the beginning have been achieved. Maybe there's been changes in circumstances that means the mentoring relationship might simply have run its course, or perhaps it's actually not working, and that's okay. As a mentor, you might realize that you're unable to make further contributions in the way that you originally envisaged. You might recognize that the support that your mentor needs is outside your own expertise or area of comfort. So that might mean that you look to support the mentee to find a new mentor who can better fit their needs. It may be that there are some practical changes, or maybe now even conflicts of interest. You might have changed, one or both of you might have changed roles where there's now a managerial relationship between you. So stepping outside and stepping away from a mentoring relationship early is not necessarily a sign of failure. It's actually a sign that you've been reflexive and actually can think about this. There's often, though, it's worth pointing out, I don't want to make it sound as if they all finish early, but often there is an ongoing relationship, or in some cases you may re-establish in a mentoring relationship after a break. There's often an ongoing relationship as well in terms of now having a a longer engagement. And it's really important when we start to engage with our mentees in different ways to remember what was shared confidentially as part of mentoring, as opposed to the relationship that we might have. So I, for example, mentored somebody where it became evident very quickly that we had some mutual research areas of interest. We deliberately didn't collaborate in the research context until after the mentoring relationship had concluded. The mentoring was focused on her teaching and developing her teaching practice. And so we've actually had a very successful number of collaborations in a research context, but they've been seen very distinctly from that mentoring that was part of an earlier engagement. So I'm going to conclude there. I'm hoping that lots of questions are coming up in your mind from this. As we've heard, mentoring can cover lots of different aspects of an academic role. My own mentoring has particularly been focused on teaching and learning and also sort of engagement aspects of the academic role. But Sam's going to take over now, and he's going to focus more on the research context, which we know is somewhere that a lot of people seek out support in terms of mentoring. So I will just stop sharing my screen and hopefully Sam will be able to do his. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those insights, Karen. I'm madly taking notes, so hopefully we'll be able to summarise all this at a later point. And please, everyone, remember to pop questions into the chat box at any time. And Sam, if you'd like to start sharing, oh, you've got it up already. Great job. Thank you very much, Sam.
All right, good morning, everyone. I think Candice and Karen spoke about mentorship from different perspectives, either from an institutional perspective, from organizations' management point of view, and Karen also mentioned this, her experience in teaching and learning. I would like to switch to a different focus about research and research performance. We know that we train researchers through our PhD training system, but my understanding is when we probably only got 10% of our career learning through our PhD, formal PhD training. A major part of our research career should be further developed after PhD. So today I'm going to talk about mentorship and sort of mentor experience after PhD. When you are into early career stage, I think finding a mentor to work with is pretty critical for your research career development and also for your personal research performance. Let me just. I would like to acknowledge, or before that, I would like to acknowledge our country as Noa Wangja people. I'm meeting you virtually, but I'm based on a campus on the land of Noa Wangja people. I respect the elders of these people from the past, present, and emerging. I also would like to acknowledge that my presentation is mainly based on my personal experience and observations over the years. And also, I have been working with a lot of colleagues across the country and also internationally. My presentation should be more about my personal experience. Of course, it bears personal bias, but some of the principles may be shared. So please understand these views may not be representing the codes of professional practice from any academic associations or any institutions or any country's institutional requirements. over the years, I summarized some of the principles. Once I form principles, I truly stick to the principles in my work. That's something I would advise colleagues in the field to follow, because once you have good working principles and you can follow the principles, your work can be better done and more effectively done. I understand that today's session is more about effective mentorship. Maybe this is for future mentors you can follow. First of all, I would like to say the basic common ground of mentorship is about a relationship. A mentor and mentee form a kind of relationship, and then they work together. But they should all, and both of them, they should understand the essence of a true scholarship. True scholarship is to seek truth and seek new knowledge to benefit the whole society, the world, or you can say that a more lofty mission of knowledge creation. So this should be complied with by both parties. In relation to that, I would stress that research integrity is critically important for both parties to work on, and you both need to agree on the integrity in research works. And the second principle I see is mentee-centered development. Even though there's a mentor and mentee, but the focus should be for the mentee, for the mentee's career development. In that sense, the mentor should sacrifice more in order to suit the mentee's needs. Somehow there's a symmetry relationship, and both asymmetry and asymmetry relationship between the two parties. I would see, when we see the status, there should be an equal status between the two parties, but we should acknowledge that in terms of power, experience, mentors are always more powerful in their academic rank and academic position, and also more experience. I also see mentorship. Effective mentorship should be a transformational relationship rather than transactional relationship. Well, some people may have a different attitude to interpret this, but I do see some practices to be transactional. I don't see a long-lasting relationship can be derived from a transactional relationship. It should be for the mentee to grow better as a researcher. But of course, a side benefit should be to the mentor. I will mention that the mentor always benefit a lot from working with mentees. Okay, I summarized some of the do's and the don'ts for mentors. I think a good mentor should put mentees' development need first. So when you consider authorship, it's more about, when you consider authorship, you should really think what kind of authorship can do best to the mentee's development. Of course, you should really stick to the authorship principle, integrity, research integrity principle for authorship. But when there's a blurring part, you should really put mentee's development need first. A mentor should be available. If a mentee needs you, you should really prioritize the mentee's need and then make yourself available. Respect the mentee as an equal partner. I think this is critically important. You shouldn't really treat a mentee as your subordinate partner. They are equal partners to you because you also benefit a lot from working with the mentee. The fourth one, I really think this should be stressed. Put research integrity as a common ground for you to work with your mentee. If your mentee cannot really stick to research integrity, you should really state that clearly, and then to tell your mentee whether he or she would like to continue the relationship. If the relationship is to be continued, just ask your mentee to be following research integrity principles. Offer constructive but honest comments. This is related to the next point. I don't see mentors should be always a nice person or knowing person. You should be a truthful person to your mentee rather than just a nice person. When you see something which is not good for the mentee's future development, say it. Don't hide it, because it's eventually good for the mentee. Don't be afraid to offering admonishing, warning advice. I think as mentors, we should really warn our mentees if they are going off track. This is our responsibility. We shouldn't be all yes person. And finally, do not exploit a mentorship relationship. What I mean by this is, I also observe that some people, senior people, may use their mentees' work for their own benefit. This is related to the third point. You should really respect the mentee as an equal partner. Let's move on. For mentees, I think more importantly, mentees should be proactive in the relationship. Don't expect the mentor to approach you to, of course, some nice mentors may be very kind. They will knock your door. They will ask what's going on, and then do you have anything to talk about? But I would expect a good mentee to be more proactive, to approach mentor for things the mentee may need to discuss. When you need to have help, go to your mentor. But on the other hand, you have to be independent. You also need to maintain your independent status. Remember that when we train a PhD, after your PhD training, you are an independent researcher. You should be able to lead a research project. Your mentor is an advisor, especially when you're working with your mentor in a project. Treat your mentor as something some person you can seek advice. Also, advise mentees to foster or develop good time management and also self-management. Manage your resources. And to some extent, your mentor is your support, is part of your support system. Manage them as well as in your resources. Managing the relationship with a professional attitude. Sometimes you could really develop a very close personal relationship. But to me, in principle, I see a mentorship is a kind of a professional relationship. So, you may not necessarily agree with me, but I see this is a professional relationship, and you should really have a professional attitude. One pitfall for mentees, especially this is from if you are from an individual cultured country, do not request equal time contribution when you are working with your mentor. I don't think time would be equal because a mentor is more experienced. Their time value may be higher than mentee. So I don't think a mentee should request the equal time contribution from a mentor. Do not expect all yes attitude from a mentor. Of course, mentor will be from time to time providing emotional support. That's part of a social support a mentor can provide to a mentee. But do not expect all yes, because you're supposed to receive disagreeing opinions from your mentor in order to benefit yourself. The last point is the same. Do not exploit a mentorship relationship. Of course, some of your mentors may be in a high position. they may be, editorship, important editorship, but that does not mean that you can always use that. Of course, some people may have that expectations. It's up to them to either open up more resources they have to you or not. This is their decision. If you have a good relationship, if they think this way they may benefit your development, they will open up it to you. But this is not a must. So remember, it depends on your professional attitude. Okay, that's all for me. I think we can have a good discussion after this.
Thank you so much, Sam. I appreciate that. If you could just stop sharing your slides, please, that would be wonderful. And thank you to all three of you, Karen, Sam and Candice, for some really insightful information there. But now we've got an opportunity to have a bit of a think about. What I might quickly do is just mention again your main points so that people can start organising their questions. We've got about 20 minutes left to have a bit of a discussion. So Candice covered very comprehensively, first of all, asked us to think about what are we talking about when we mean mid-career academic, but just how important it is to be organised and structured with our mentoring with regards to linking it to an objective, making sure that it's a professional and safe situation, and really importantly that it's not a surprise to the mentee that they're actually being mentored as an important part of that. And Karen talked about a couple of really good points to access with regards to both the Corthy mentoring program, but also the Royal Society mentoring and research links that were available there, and you'll be able to pop back into the session to find those links if you need. About how important it is to mentor on the needs of the mentee, and then managing those expectations, roles, relationships as a part of that conversation, how to get started, how to structure the sessions, make sure the spaces are safe for people, and then reviewing, always listening, questioning, reframing, acknowledgement for that, and then validation as well. And then we've just heard from Sam, who covered in particular mentoring after a PhD from his own personal experiences, some of the do's and don'ts involved with that, but the mentoring or the mentorship principles around essence of true scholarship, mentee-centered development, the status symmetry versus the power experience symmetry, and then transformational versus transactional relationships in that space. I see that Karen, thank you, has put into the chat the link to the Royal Society mentoring guidelines and the Corthy one as well. Kirsten has suggested perhaps we mention the Corthy kindness campaign. Karen, would you like to talk a little bit about that before we get on to the other questions?
Yeah, I was really thinking about it, and thanks, Kirsten, for the prompt. When Sam was talking about kind of the that a mentor relationship doesn't have to all be about the all yes, and that sometimes it's about a little bit about some of those hard truths. But I think it fits really nicely within the Corthy kindness campaign, where we've been doing some work from senior right down to our junior colleagues, thinking about that actually we are an academy, that we are a group who are supportive of each other. And I think mentoring is a really great way where that kindness aspect comes. Sometimes being kind does mean some direct hard truths, but it's how they're framed within a supportive mentoring relationship, which I think means that they still are part of that. You know, how do we support each other with kindness? How do we support each other by recognizing the positives? And I think mentoring is a really great way of doing that.
Thanks very much, Karen. Now, I'm not sure if participants are able to pop their microphones on rather than pop something in the chat. Is there anyone who would like to ask a question rather than pop something into chat? I don't have anyone there. I've got a lot of questions for myself to ask if no one else jumps in. I'd be interested to hear from the three of you about reflective opportunities. So reflection on I guess the relationship, but also on your own practice, and whether you personally structure that into your, I guess, mentorship and how you guide then your mentees with regards to how they reflect on their own practices. Candice, would you have a response to that?
Yeah, I mean, one thing as I get older, I'm trying to work on is just be a bit more comfortable with silence. So, I mean, academics were often amazing talkers, but sometimes we need to remember to just be quiet and listen. And I think just, you know, often in those early sessions, a mentor might turn up with a laundry list of things that they want to improve in their career. And so it's just a bit of realism and saying, well, no one, you know, we can't fix all this all at once. Let's just choose one thing. So sort of lessen a bit of the expectations, take some just time to listen. As a mentor, not feel as though you have to have all the answers all the time. I think reflecting on too, sometimes we get it wrong. You know, we might give our lessons and our experiences and our learnings and our beliefs, and then find out that they might be working in quite a different faculty or quite a different work environment, and that's just not how things are done. So yeah, I think just being a bit more real and a bit more honest about it. And there are disappointments in the academic career. Let's pretend there, you know, let's not pretend for a minute that there aren't. You know, there can be everything from journal rejections to perhaps, you know, having to apply for promotion more than once, to missing out on funding apps, to disappointing feedback from students. So yeah, just, you know, I think not pretending that mentoring will be the silver bullet to fix everything.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Karen, do you have any thoughts with regards to reflective practice for yourself or for your mentees?
Yeah, I think that I made a point of sort of mentioning around that kind of, you know, that authenticity of mentoring. I think Sam and Candice have both touched on that as well. But I think in choosing to be a mentor, I think you are at times sort of opening yourself to exposing the things that haven't gone right, as well as things that have gone well in your own experiences as well. And so I think that's sort of also part of that kind of acknowledgement and validation aspect of mentoring, that you know, you might have your mentee come and be really downhearted that that key article they thought was amazing has been rejected. And it's about kind of sharing, well, actually all of us get rejections, and I've shared rejections that I've had with my mentees, and I've shared things that I've sort of been happy about as well. But I think it is that kind of that aspect of authenticity, and part of that being reflexive is thinking about when you want to share but not dominate. So it's not all about me. My career has gone in a particular way, and sometimes that's gone well, and other times it's been challenging. I'm happy to share both those, but also, as Candice said, recognize that's not your career. That's not my mentee's experience. And particularly, I think that Candice's point that sometimes we think, particularly I think when I've mentored within my own institution, one of the things I've learned is just how different we are within our own institution. And that's been fascinating to learn as a mentor. I've had insights into other parts of my institution, which now that I'm in a more senior role myself and working with other associate deans in other faculties have really helped inform me as well. So taking my reflection from a mentoring into my own career, I think has been important as well.
Wonderful, thank you. I was checking the chat on Zoom as opposed to the conference portal, so now I see there are lots of questions there. So I'm going to move across and go through the ones that have the most number of likes, the top ones. So I can see Ming Ming's got a question there around, sometimes I hesitate to give advice, as in my career, some of the advice I've received, I feel it was not suitable. If I'd taken the advice, it will end up in a career that I don't feel comfortable with. So how do you define a good mentor in that space? So that's the question. Does anyone want to take that particular approach with regards to the advice fitting the career that makes people comfortable?
I mean, I think Sam had a good disclaimer, you know, the beginning of the slide, say this is based on, you know, sort of my experience. So do you want to pick that up, Sam, by saying, because I thought that was a great disclaimer.
Yeah, well, I can, because the question is, you know, a bit out of a context when you say advice, you know, because we don't know the nature of the advice. So again, I would like to address this in relation to the reflective practice. I think from time to time, we all need to, as mentors and mentees, we all need to reflect on our specific relationships with a particular mentor or mentees. Remember that as individuals, we are all very different. As a mentor, you might be working with all different types of mentees with personalities. And you have your own personality. That's why in most cases, the relationship is a kind of art rather than, science. You can't really, you need to be reflexible enough. But I truly agree that authenticity is so important. Both parties should really stay truthful to each other. If they don't really treat this relationship to be truthful, I don't think that, some, as Candice mentioned, this is not a marriage. Even though this is forced, in some cases, a mentor-mentee relationship seems to be a enforced marriage by the organization. Both persons are in, but if this is the case, I don't see it will be working. But Ming Ming's question, I don't really, I can't really capture the essence of the issue because we don't know what kind of, but if you have your, if you have received some advice which you think will not really benefit your career, show your appreciating attitude to the mentor, but you, as I mentioned, that you are independent.
Sam, can I just
the mentor is just in your support system. They should not really dominate your career development. You steer your own career development. That's my answer.
Sam, I've just thought of something too that could be helpful here. A lot of time in academia, we don't have much choice. We don't have much choice about who our line manager is going to be. There's various heads of departments and you have to work with, a few characters over the years, including, me. But mentoring, you often do get to sort of choose. You're presented with another party in the relationship and you can go, yeah, that seems like a good fit. They're not necessarily kind of forced on you. So I'd actually, it's fine if you don't like the advice from your mentor because, if I'm being a bit cut dry about it, you could probably find another mentor before too long. And you don't always have that luxury in academia. You don't necessarily get to choose your HOD, for example. So I think that's not necessarily a bad thing if you don't necessarily relate to your mentor, because you could probably get another one before too long.
Can I just add one point? From my experience as mentor, when I offer advices to mentees, some of my mentees, not all, some of my mentees, they don't take my advice. I'm okay with that. It's completely okay. I offer the advice. Of course, as I said, everybody is limited in their own length. You can take it and you may not. It's not really that advice. You must take it. But a mentee should also have a very good understanding of his or her own development environment. I think you can have your own personal strategies. That's why I think this is something you can take on. You don't necessarily need to take every advice.
Thank you, Sam. Great, that's great. Thank you. Mingy, I hope that answered your question with regards to your question there. Aaron has asked a question about how long a relationship should last and when is it time to move on. Now, I think, Karen, you covered something at the start of your presentation about, even if it was a 6 months to 1 year sort of thing, but I wonder whether maybe Aaron's question is about whether there's a point in the relationship where you feel that's no longer productive. Would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, I think Candice actually mentioned the sort of 6 to 12 months, but
Candice,
certainly
yeah.
sort of the programs that I've been in, that's sort of been the I would say the natural length of many of the relationships. I think the bit about sort of when it's no longer productive relates also, I think Dennis also asked a question about trust. I think that's partly about building trust in the mentoring relationship and actually being open to discuss when actually this has become a sort of a like, oh, we've got that meeting, but I'm not really sure this is kind of good use of either of our time. And I think it's having, I try and build in some sort of not probably sort of, if I know this is going to be maybe a 6 to 12 months, maybe after sort of 5 months, actually have a sort of, well, why don't we talk today around how it's going? Let's reflect back on where we are. You know, actually scheduling a check-in, and if you've built some trust, I think it being open about whether or not as a mentor you feel you can no longer help or support, or you think that somebody else could actually do a better job, I think is part of that sort of openness of that relationship. I think it's sometimes harder for the mentee to say no to the mentor, particularly if the mentor is sort of there's quite a big power sort of balance there. So I do think that it's a responsibility of a mentor to kind of make sure that that option is open. I should say, also had some relationships which have just kind of, I suppose, fizzled out. We've not organised the next meeting initially. I've left it to the mentee to come back, and they haven't. And in the couple of cases, there have been people in my own institution who I wouldn't regularly see. They've been on a different campus. And when in both cases I've later bumped into them, they've been really positive about the experience, but they just no longer needed it. And they didn't know that when we last met, but the fact that they weren't sort of reaching out to organise another meeting. And that can be a bit weird from a mentor's perspective, because you're kind of wondering what's happening. I, in both cases, just dropped them an email to say, yeah, let me know if you want to meet again. But I think that often is what happens. It does just move on, and the mentee no longer is getting, or has reached their goals and is no longer leading that relationship.
Terrific, thank you. Candice or Sam, did you want to add anything to that with regards to timings?
Well,
Otherwise,
just one point.
Yeah.
Candice, do you want to add?
You go, Sam, then I'll jump in after you.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's a really, you know, after a formal mentorship arrangement, it depends on, you know, how the two persons feel like to work together. In most cases, in my experience, it's like if the mentee has a research project, you invite mentor to join in again, yeah, the relationship will continue in that way. If the two do not have some concrete platform to work on in the short term, it may be dormant for a certain time, but when it comes up again, you know, sometimes it's not really that clear cut in a timeline. You can come back to have that relationship again if both mainly, you know, it's or sometimes it's the mentor to approach mentee to work together, and then they may be in a team, and then in that specific project, the relationship may still continue like a mentor-menteeship relationship.
thank you.
I see we're out of time, so I'm just going to throw a couple of things in. It's a little bit off the topic, food for thought. I guess in universities, we have conceptualized mentoring in a very traditional sense. There are some organizations out there doing some quite funky stuff. One idea that's been played with, and I don't like the term, is reverse mentoring. So where quite senior people are mentored by someone very junior in the organization. I think another idea in universities that we could be playing with a lot more is mentoring between professional and academic staff. At the moment, we tend to line academics up with academics. But imagine if your mentor was in a completely different university, you know, sort of head of student enrollments or something. Imagine the new learning that you could probably take on there, etc. So look, it's good, and it needs to be in a definite time frame. And I'd suggest that if you haven't been able to solve an issue within 6 months, then it's either very poorly conceived and structured issue, or one or either parties hasn't really put the effort in. So, you know, why would you kind of want to stay in it long term, I guess? I mean, you might become friends, don't get me wrong, or co-authors or collaborators or colleagues. There's a whole lot of other ways you can stay in touch professionally and over a coffee or something, but and that formal mentoring relationship, there does need to be an endpoint.
Thank you, Candice. We've only got about a minute or half a minute left. There was one question in there that a few people like with regards to trust, and I wonder whether as a sign off, the three of you would be happy just to give 1 or 2 words with regards to trust and mentoring, please. Karen, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I think I mentioned before, for me, it's about kind of developing that authenticity in the relationship, that it's actually being at times quite vulnerable and open about your own experiences to validate, but also give a safe space for for the mentee. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Sam, just 1 or 2 words with regards to trust.
No doubt. This is the precondition for a mentorship relationship. If there's no trust, no mentorship at all.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Candice, finally.
Look, New Zealand is a very small village. If you start telling war stories about things you've experienced and people you've worked with, it'll get back to people. So that's why we particularly need trust in this country. And I imagine Australia, you know, we all know the certain journal editors someone might be talking about. So yeah, just be professional.
Thank you very much. And as someone has put in the note there, thank you especially to our New Zealand presenters, Professor Smith and Harris, who are joining us on a public holiday. Thank you very much for your time, and also to you, Professor Huang, as well, for those wonderful insights into effective mentoring. And I'm sure people will link up with you during the conference if they've got any additional questions they want to ask you through the platform. So thank you once again very much for your insights. Thank you everyone for joining us. We've now got a half an hour break, and then we've got quite a long session with regards to another session on managing sustainable and meaningful careers. And then we have our own mentoring sessions, which you've all been assigned to. And then we've got the closing ceremony before the lunch break. So have a great break, stretch your legs, and I look forward to seeing you all back in the Managing Sustainable and Meaningful Careers session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.